Good afternoon, everyone. So, welcome for today's synchronous learning session. So, we're going to focus on week 2, which is the 12 principles of animation. So, before we begin, just a few reminders for today's session. Number one is please have the modules ready while discussing. So, for today, I'll be screen sharing the notes, but due to internet connectivity, there might be some issues. So, one issue might be because of my internet connection, you might not be able to see it, or maybe to your end, it might not be as clear as you might like it to be. As such, please have the PDF version of the modules ready or the Canvas page open so that you can see the animations. If you can open the Canvas page, it would be much better. That being, you can see the animations much more clearly. Next one, please be on your best behavior because our session for today shall be recorded and uploaded. So I'll be doing that one for all of the sessions and I'll be choosing probably one session. Next one, please make sure that your microphone is functional. If not, or if you don't have any mic, please respond quickly through the text channels per section. So your ICT Animation 12D section. So for those with no microphone, please use that as quickly as possible. Once na natawag kayo, mag-reply kayo agad. And then lastly, another session shall be held after the classes. After my discussion. So the question is, I'll be asking this to some of your volunteers. What do you think is the most important principle of animation is and why? So same then as before, it's more or less just a short reflection, and you can answer in a few sentences, probably around 1 and 2. So for this lesson, I'm not going to go so much on the details. I'll just be emphasizing on a lot of things which are critical for the 12 principles of animation. So with that one, I hope you were able to read it ahead of time. If not, let's try to focus on the important ones. And then after that, you are recommended to read it once again before we move on to the quiz. So with that one, let's start already with the lesson. So your 12 principles of animation is one of the more important concepts that you'll have to learn. So starting next week by module 3 up until module 10, it's more on the practical applications. It's more of a concept. However, this concept is necessary for you to actually do yung in-betweening and other animation aspects in such a way that these are some of the concepts that you'll have to take note of while you are doing the animation process. So before we move on, just a little bit on the introduction. So I won't be placing on your quiz pala, just to be clear. I won't be placing who are the Disney animators, what is the book reference. I would focus more on the direct practical applications of the 12 principles of animation. So, however, just a little bit of introduction. The ones who created the 12 principles of animation were Disney animators. These Disney animators have been present with the Disney company ever since, I believe, Snow White or even Sleeping Beauty at the very least. So after all of their years in creating animations, they've published a book called The Illusion of Life Disney Animation. So it's meant to be used for traditional animation. However, a lot of the concepts right here are still applicable to other animation styles like paperless, digital, 2D animation, 3D animation, and so on. So the 12 principles of animation can be divided into two parts. Number one, some of the principles focus on its adherence to the laws of physics. So, yung mga ideas natin in physics is something critical when we're talking about the 12 principles of animation. It is for you to identify so that the motion is done more realistically, albeit it's a bit more exaggerated due to the idea of exaggeration. So with this one, when I'm explaining some of the things, or when you're doing animation, you also have to have some idea of physics. Like for example, the idea of acceleration, deceleration, speed, velocity. We also have air resistance. We also have projectile motion. We also have kinetic energy, potential energy, all of those things. So it would mostly focus on those ones. Next one. It would also focus on abstract issues. So this is more of the artistic value. Yung first one would focus more on the technicalities of an animation. Whereas for the second one, it would focus more on its artistic quality, making it more inclusive or making it more appealing for audiences that you have chosen for. So here we have 12 principles of animation. In the original text, you would see here that squash and stretch is actually the very first one, whereas drawing is the last one. However, na-arrange siya in such a way that staging is the first one up until solid drawing, because I feel na in the animation workflow, you actually have to move on to these ones first before the other ones. So for example, yung appeal and staging natin is best done when you are doing pre-production. And then afterwards, post-to-post and straight-ahead animation is done more by more in production. So animators, before you actually move on to the post-to-post, then afterwards you can do the timing. So that's just a way of how I've arranged yung 12 principles of animation natin. And I hope it would enable you to understand these concepts better, because it mostly follows yung animation workflow natin. So, we have here the 12 principles of animation. The first one is staging. So, yung staging natin is done mostly by the storyboard artist. And ang paggawa natin is to make sure that the ideas that you are presenting in your animation is completely and unmistakably clear. So, here's the thing about animations compared to that of live action. When you're creating a live action movie, it's okay for you to add very small nuances, very small, subtle facial expressions. You can't necessarily do that in an animation. Kasi yung sa may live action natin, when we're moving our faces, you have very specific ways of doing. I mean, you have very subtle ways of doing it. You have like a lot of muscles that can move at very different intensities that would give you specific facial expressions. How our faces are constructed, for example, is very complex. So may mga planes tayo na medyo complex when you're studying it. When you're doing animation, so like for example, when you're creating a simple character, you don't really have those muscles. You don't really have the planes of a human face. It's possible for you to do those, however, lots of times you're oversimplifying it. So with that one, a lot of the smaller nuances are almost impossible to create in an animation. If it's possible for you to do it, it would not translate as very well. So you have to make sure that how you present it is very clear. So how can you do that when you're doing staging? So number one is the effective use of camera shots and angles. So the use of different camera shots and angles, or how a scene is presented, can help you create a story. There are also some there are also some camera shots and angles that would present different types of ideas. So for example, we have here close up and then long shot. So yung sa may close up natin, you can see mostly the face. So when you're creating when you're using a close up shot, you would mostly use it for facial expressions or character expressions. It would be impractical for you to use it for fighting scenes because you won't necessarily see the actions. Next one, if you were to go to a medium shot, to a long shot, it's okay for you to show yung mga body movements. But if you were to create subtle facial expressions, you're unable to do that in a long shot or a wide shot kasi hindi rin lang siya mapapansin. So, just for reference, the medium shot is actually the most common type of shot, or known as the default shot. So, the reason for that one being, you can basically see everything. You can see the facial expressions, you can see some of the movements, albeit half body lang, and you can still see some of the background. So, you can get an idea of everything that's happening around you through the use of a medium shot. So at the bottom right here, like low angle, high angle, establishing shot, the Dutch angle or tilt, and point of view would give you other types of would give you other types of effects. So next one, we'll be moving on to the pose or action and how to use it. So yung poses natin or yung actions natin have to clearly communicate to the audience the following: the attitude, the mood, the reaction, or the idea of the character. Whatever they're doing has to be as clear as possible. So how do you make sure that your action or pose is clear enough? So number one, make sure that there is a line of action. So natutunan na natin when we were in grade 11, but essentially, the line of action is this curved line that would showcase the main movement of the action. Having a line of action would showcase that you have a clear dynamic action, and it's very well defined. This definition is further enhanced if you make sure that your action is well defined as a silhouette. So yung silhouette natin is essentially a blackened version of your action. So yung actions natin, even though that they are extremely they are in one color, usually black, it has to be as clear as possible. So you would not be able to see any facial expressions, any details on the muscles, any details of everything else. The one that you will have to rely on is the outline of your body. And you have to make sure that the outline of the body has to be as clear as possible. So for example, we have an example here from a fight scene in Avatar. You can see right here that the one on the left is clearly attacking. You can see where the arm is, you can see the stance. However, you can't necessarily see yung hand right here. So that can be a point for improvement. Whereas the one on the right, you can clearly see that it's dodging because whatever that attack is right here coming from the left character is now dodged by this character because it's quite out away from the left side character, and you can see that the character has this very clear line of action, almost a letter C. You can see the arms and legs, you can see the hands and feet, you can even see the hairstyle. So that's an example of a well-defined silhouette. Next one is to avoid tangents. So yung tangents na to, if you're going to see it in your example, it's very well clearly encircled. Or essentially, a tangent are two lines from two different objects that are touching at exactly one point. So when you're creating tangents like these ones, it actually maintains the continuity of both items. So that's a bad thing in an animation. Being is that they're turning into one object. And you have to make sure that they are two separate objects. If you're adding a tangent, you're basically joining them together. So one example of that one is Katara's shoulder, like right here on the right side. And you have here yung parang brick wall. So having yung, ito medyo okay pa siya because the angle of the shoulder is quite different to that of the plane. Pero it's almost close. So parang if medyo titignan mo siya ng malayuan or at first glance, you might even think that the row of bricks right here and her shoulder is essentially one thing. And as much as possible, we prevent that even at its very first glance. Last one for this part is avoiding having too much action in one scene. So this one as an illustration itself is pretty good. It actually showcases a lot of different things. It's okay as an illustration because you can simply stop it and then you can look at the different items individually. Or like let's say if this frame is in a storyboard, like 2 seconds lang siya, and so many things are happening in those 2 seconds, it would be very confusing as a viewer. So as much as possible, you only have one action per frame. Just to be clear din pala, yung action na yun has to be one main action or two main actions. There would also be like a lot of other things like secondary action. Lastly, for staging, you have to make sure that your background as well as your animation design have to coincide with each other. You have to make sure na pag Western animation yung characters natin, Western animation yung background. Pag Japanese animation, you have to use Japanese backgrounds or Japanese effects. So an example of this one is Space Ghost is that it utilizes hand-drawn animation. So 2D talaga siya. Another thing is they have photographic characters. But essentially, the point here is you have these 2D characters and then you have this 3D or almost photographic background. So it kind of gives you off to the idea. So when you're creating an animation, another idea that you have to take note of is immersion. So you have to make sure that you're kind of part in this world, and when you are doing something like this, you kind of see that they are off. Medyo nag-offset siya sa'yo. So with doesn't look very immersive, which is okay for this one because it's an adult swim cartoon. Or if you're going to do this for children's animations, hindi siya magandang tignan. Next one is for appeal. So appeal is the second one. Mostly this is utilized by concept artists when they are creating their character. So when we talk about live action characters, you have something which we call as charisma. So when we say charisma, you have different standards for certain types of characters. So in live action, even though we don't want to admit it, a lot of the actors that you would see there are physically attractive. Because if they're not physically attractive, if you have like someone who is not that attractive as a main role, hindi siya papatok sa box office or somewhere else. Another one for charisma is you have to make sure that the characters look pleasing enough. So, for example, if you're working at a 1990s, let's say, a good example is Titanic. So, Titanic is 1920s. Yung clothing nila is very 1920s. The sceneries is 1920s. Pero if you place someone there whose makeup is more for 1920s, hindi siya magandang tignan or it kind of offsets the audience. So you have to make sure that the way that the character is made up is still very looking like a 1990s character. You can also see that in animated cartoons, like for example, Snow White. So Snow White is set in 1700s Germany. Or if you were to see the character design of Snow White, the main character, she's actually modeled in a lot of 1930s superstar icons. So something like that. Pero for animation, what you have to focus on is not necessarily how physically attractive a character is, but it's more on how appealing a character is. Appeal focuses more on how unique a character is, how stand out of it compared to that of the other characters. It doesn't necessarily matter whether they're physically attractive or not, as long as they are unique. Kaya yung, kung napapansin ninyo, one of your criterias when we were having our animation 11A and even in your animation 11B is appeal. The reason being you have to make sure that your character is unique enough and it's not very generic looking. It doesn't matter necessarily to us whether it's attractive looking, for as long as it looks unique, you're okay. So, as much as possible, when we're creating our own characters, it has to be appealing. So how do you do that? So we have three. Number one, the use of basic shapes and proportions. Number two is color. And then number three is drawing design or art style or animation style. Just a disclaimer, just because ito yung nakalagay na how to make an appealing character doesn't necessarily mean that this is the general rule. A lot of the examples that I'll be showing you is very classic animation like 1950s, 1940s, and so on and so forth. You would notice that a lot of the rules or a lot of the tips that were stated here have a lot of exceptions in modern media today. The reason being, we would like to subvert expectations. It's possible for you to follow this one, but if you don't want to follow it, it's okay as well. Pero ito kasi this is mostly used for more of children's cartoons. Pero even then, they are being subverted. Anyway, here are some ways on how you can create an appealing character. Number one is the use of basic shapes and proportions. So when you're creating a character, obviously every single character has its own basic shape and own set of proportions. However, using a certain type of combination can give you a certain archetype. Itong archetype na to is like, you can consider it as like a stereotype, pero it's more of like a profile. That's a better term. It's a profile. So here we have different types of common archetypes. So you would see this a lot in very classic cartoons like Looney Tunes, Hanna-Barbera, classic Disney, and so on and so forth. Number one is Screwball. Screwball is characterized by the following. Pear-shaped body, elongated head, long and skinny neck, and big feet. So these are the characters that you would consider as smart aleck. Ibig sabihin, they're smart, yet at the same time they're arrogant or they're cocky. And how they create their humor is more of outsmarting these types of characters. So, parang ganun siya. Best example is Bugs Bunny. Bugs Bunny tends to outsmart a lot of the characters that he meets. And, pag titignan mo yung characteristics niya, he's smart, yet at the same time, he's a little bit arrogant. So, something like that, yung Screwball type. We also have other types, like the cute or the baby character. This is still something that you would see in a lot of modern cartoons. So they're characterized by essentially looking a baby. So big head, small body, squishy body parts, huge eyes. If you want to give your character like a shy or coy personality, or if you want to give them a more cute characteristic, you can have this type of archetype. Nextly, we have Goofy, which is the best example really is Goofy from Disney, wherein you can see the character is slouch. Usually, this is a tall character with a slouched shoulder. You can see that they have buck teeth, not really the smartest person in the character roster. So you can have these types of characters. Lastly, we have the heavy or pugnacious. You can clearly see by its character design what its personality is. Big body, small head. Next one is we have color. So color, associating different colors to your characters can give off different personalities. So like we have here different examples. So like if you use color red, you can emphasize more of royalty or maturity. If the character has more red colors, they tend to be more passionate or hot-headed and so on and so forth. So here we have a few examples. So we have Snow White here on the first photo, which is more of these light colors, especially her red, like her bright red bow and her yellow skirt. And then you have the evil queen disguised as an old witch, which is color black and then color green yung eyes niya. So you can see here clearly who is the protagonist and you can see here clearly who's the antagonist simply by just seeing the colors. However, itong mga colors na to can also be subverted or it can be determined according to the culture of where it came from. So one example is this one from Avatar. So if you watch the scene, this is actually a dream sequence. And it's influenced by two people, or this character's two main influencers. So the one in color red is a good character. So ito yung parang good influence niya. The one in blue is the character's bad influence. So traditionally in Western animation, you would know color blue as more of a good character and red as a more evil character. However, since we're talking about Japanese or Chinese influences in Avatar The Last Airbender, you would see that, and in Asian influences, ang lucky colors are usually color red. So you would see the color red as a good character, whereas the blue is a bit more evil. Last example for color, you can see this a lot in Japanese animations, is your main character tends to have a standout color style. So it's a meme at its own right now, yung spot the main character na meme. So we have an example here from Shokugeki no Soma. So the main character, Soma, you can clearly see red hair compared to his other classmates who are brown, black hair. Another one is yung diner outfit niya na color black. Whereas his other classmates would use this chef cuisine white uniform. So you would clearly see that there's a difference between this character and the other character. So it's very easy for you to determine who the main character is from the others. And then lastly for appeal, drawing and animation styles. So when you're creating your own animation or when you're creating a story, the very first thing that you have to create, not necessarily as an animator or as the animation workflow, but when you're creating an idea, you have to know first your audience. So later on sa may practical research, probably you've heard about this, you have to know first who your audience is. Where are you going to give that research for? So same din sa may animation. You have to know who your main audiences are first. Determining the main audiences could help you identify the proper drawing and animation styles that would make it more appealing for them. So for example, Western animation caters more to Western audiences. Japanese animation caters more to Eastern audiences. However, as I've stated, this is not necessarily the rule. You can see like a lot of Japanese animation very popular in the West. Another one is the character designs. For simplistic character designs like Powerpuff Girls, you would see here that it's mostly for children. Whereas for more complicated character designs like Beavis and Butthead, you can see that it's more for adults. The reason being, for children, they want to draw more of their favorite characters. And it's easier for them to draw their favorite characters if it's more simplistic and more basic shapes. So it's a part of their immersion or it's a part of marketing essentially. And then lastly, we have here shonen is meant more for male audiences. Shoujo is meant for more female ones. So it's very obvious already if you translate shonen, it means boy, whereas shoujo it basically means girl. You can also see that the genre and the styles that they use are more for male and more for female. For example, sa may shonen, a lot of these ones are adventure fantasy stories, whereas for shoujo, it's more of romance, slice of life. Sa may shonen natin, you will see that the design is a bit more simplistic, so it doesn't have a lot of hair strands, it doesn't have very complicated eyes, it doesn't have a lot of detail in the hair, although for shonen, admittedly, they have more outrageous hairstyles. That being, you want to make it a bit more simplistic for the action scenes. Mahirap namang mag-animate ng maraming hair strands if you're doing a fight scene. Whereas for shoujo, you would see that a lot of its detailing it's very detailed. So yung mata pa lang ang dami ng gagawin. For the hair, it has a lot of hair strands. That would give you the idea that this it's more shoujo in terms of its drawing style. Next one is straight ahead and post-to-post animation. So from straight ahead and post-to-post animation, this is more for the production stage. So it would be a bit better for you to learn about the production stages like cleanup and in-betweening before you truly understand this. So I'll just be introducing them mostly. So first one is straight ahead and post-to-post animation. Straight ahead and post-to-post animation is the process of how you're going to create your animation. So, post to post, essentially, you're animating it in halves. So, you're finding the middle between two keyframes. So, post to post is you're gonna get two keyframes, hahanapin mo yung gitna. Like for this one in the head turn. So, you have three creations. So, you have these two. And then you're going to find the middle, which is at the middle. And then afterwards, you're going to take the first and then the middle frame, hahanapin mo na naman yung gitna. Until you're able to do that for the first half. Hahati at hahatiin mo hanggang makuha mo lahat ng frames for the first half. From the first half, now you're going to move to the second half. And you're going to do the same process. You're basically dividing them into two until you're able to get all of the keyframes. So that's for post-to-post animation. Straight ahead animation is creating the first drawing to the next drawing. So ito kasi, you basically go from one and then last and then gitna. Ito, the first one, and then the second one, and then the third one, and so on and so forth. So, when yung post-to-post animation natin, this is the one that will be taught to you. The reason being, this planning actually helps you create a better animation flow. Whereas for straight ahead, it's more for experienced animators, to be quite frank. The reason being, you have to understand the motion much better for you to be able to create straight ahead. But it has its own advantage. So, ang straight ahead, it's mostly used for more spontaneous animation. So, if you want to make it a bit more quirky, then it's possible for you to do that through the use of straight ahead animation. Another good example of straight ahead animation application is something which we call as rotoscoping, which will be presented later on. So, next one we have here, timing. So, timing, after mo maplano mo yung animation mo, you're going to have to now determine the speed of the action. Actually, mas maganda na ipagsabay ito when you're creating your animation. So timing would determine how many drawings you'll be needing for you to create a certain movement. So there are different types of timing. So you have, first of all, more drawings. So itong more drawings na to can result in a slower and smoother action. Again, more drawings is for slower action. If you want to create a slower action, that is used mostly for dramatic effect, like Death Note. So this one right here. For those who are using their PDFs, ito na yung example natin for the animation. I think I have linked it naman for you guys to see how it works. Or essentially for this one, you can see that the movement is very slow and therefore making it more dramatic. Next one naman is fewer drawings. So for fewer drawings, it's mostly used for action scenes and it results in a faster and more crisp action. So when you're creating fight scenes, it's much more practical to have them generally quick. Kasi nga, number one, as an animator, you don't really want to draw a lot of things that can't necessarily be seen by the naked eye. For the audience, hindi mo rin lang mapapansin yung difference between siguro 12 frames compared to that of 24 frames in an action sequence. So it would be much more practical for you to use fewer drawings. Last one naman is the variety of slow and fast drawing. So changing them up in one scene is actually it's a good idea if you want to add more interest or if you want to add more texture in your scenes. So a good example of that one is itong fight scene na to. So if you just have a generally fast fight scene altogether, what would happen is that it doesn't look very interesting. Adding some slow motion would allow you to give more emphasis on certain movements. So the example that is actually here is the Legend of Korra. So you have a very fast action at first and then immediately magsa-slow down siya for you to be able to be emphasized on how the main character is dodging the attacks. So that is for fast and slow drawings. Next one, how is timing applicable? So timing helps you give meaning to movement in such a way that you're able to project your idea. So having, like, let's say the same speed for bowling ball and feather is very impractical, and it doesn't give you so much texture and so much integrity to a movement. Next one is it helps you idea for weight. So another way for you to give more idea for weight is actually squash and stretch. However, timing also helps. So an example right here. For your bowling ball, it tends to move faster. Whereas for feathers, it tends to move slower. So therefore, yung timing dapat nung bowling ball, lesser frames. For feather, more frames. We also have more examples here that would showcase your weight, resistance, impact, as well as kick. Next one we have here, slow in and slow out. Slow in and slow out is actually a part of timing. So again, if you have more time, if you have more drawings, it would be slower. If you have lesser drawings, it would be faster. Slow in and slow out focuses on more drawings. Drawings at the beginning, drawings at the end, and drawings at the beginning and then the end. It is also possible for you to have more drawings at the middle. However, that's not really it's not really recommended because in an artistic side, you don't really see a lot of movements happening or a lot of slow movements happening at the middle. Usually, some may start, some may end, and then there would be a little bit at the middle. Pero never mabilis yung, or let's say, mabagal yung action sa may gitna, and then at the start and at the end, it would be slower. So, just a few variations. One is slow in. Slow in is basically more movements at the end. So you would see right here that there are more drawings at the end, whereas the ones at the beginning, they tend to be faster and therefore lesser drawings. Slow out, an example, it's better known as acceleration. So ibig sabihin, there are more drawings at the beginning, and as time passes by, you would see that the drawings become lesser and lesser. Therefore, it becomes faster. Slow in and slow out actually gives you more emphasis to the action, particularly the keyframes. Because when you're creating, like, let's say, an action, the most important parts are the keyframes, which is at the beginning and at the end. So therefore, it's okay for you to have lesser drawings at the middle. Next one is for anticipation. So anticipation is actually part of how you're going to create an action. It's part of your action. So you have your starting position, action, take, overshoot, and settle. So anticipation is usually the second part. Anticipation is known as the preparation of an action. For you to be able to create a more impactful action, you have to have a significant anticipation. If you don't have anticipation, like the GIF below this one, below the jump cycle, yung first one, as you can see right here, wala siya masyadong anticipation. So therefore, yung talon niya, even though that they are technically around the same height, it doesn't look as impactful. Whereas for the second one and the third one, you can see that there's a bit more impact to it because of its anticipation. Another example, in terms of technical applications, you can think about it as its transference from potential energy into kinetic energy. Pag wala ka masyadong potential energy, then you will not have an impactful kinetic energy. Another example, aside from jumping, is when you're swinging your bat to, like, let's say, sa may baseball, when you're gonna hit a ball in baseball. So, like, let's say, if you're not gonna place your bat, or if you're not gonna place the bat at your back, pag, like, let's say, nasa may shoulder level mo lang siya, and then you hit something, tendency is that you won't be able to get so much impact. Pero pag, let's say, your bat is at the back, magsa-start ka sa likod, you would have much more potential energy. And then, yung potential energy na yun, turning it into kinetic energy, it would be much more powerful a swing. Another example is when you're punching someone, or when you're creating a punch. If you just create a punch without any anticipation, tendency is that that punch won't necessarily be as powerful. But if you put your fist a bit back and then suddenly punch someone, you would have much more potential energy stored, which would then be turned to kinetic energy. So something like that. Next one is exaggeration. Exaggeration, this is more of an artistic prospect actually. So exaggeration, this is something that you can add later on more when you're doing your timing or even when you're creating your keyframes. So exaggeration is defined as a caricature of facial expressions, facial features, poses, attitudes, and actions. Exaggeration is not necessarily the same as distortion. Exaggeration, its main purpose is to emphasize some actions to make it look more natural. Because as stated a while ago, it's impossible for you to create very small, or it's almost impossible for you to create small nuances or very subtle actions in animation. So you have to emphasize it a little bit more. Distortion, on the other hand, is emphasizing it in such a way that it looks unnatural to the design or in the animation as a whole. So we have here an example. It's a meme of it on itself, Kakegori faces. So you would see that this face in Japanese animation is unnatural. Because in Japanese in real life action, this might be okay. Because naturally when you extend your face a little bit, you would clearly see like these lines at your nose, the lines at your mouth, even your eye bags, even by just expressing a little bit. When you're expressing a lot, then you would also see these ones. Even in natural real life scenarios, you won't necessarily see this face. Adding these lines to the face as well as exaggerating it so much would make it so that the character looks unnatural. And if you see the normal design, it doesn't really permit this kind of distortion. Kaya nagiging distortion siya instead of an exaggeration. Another way for you to do exaggeration is when you're doing rotoscoping. So rotoscoping, I believe this is mostly seen by K-pop animation. So you would see a lot of people like trace the drawing, like let's say yung mga drawing videos of a lot of K-pop stars, and then you would see a difference there. So for example, you would see that in the live action or in the K-pop dance, you would see that it's very expressive. It looks really cool. Whereas if you try and trace it, it's not necessarily about the difference in skill. Even though that you have traced it frame by frame, you would see that there's actually a difference. Yung sa may live action natin, it looks natural, it looks cool. Whereas for the animated version, the rotoscope version rather, it looks very robotic. The reason being you don't have the facial expressions, you don't have the medium to do these very subtle dances. So, pag nag-rotoscope tayo, it's important for you to change up some of the action. So, you can trace this one frame by frame. However, it is necessary for you to distort it a little bit. Because if you don't distort it, or if you don't exaggerate it a little bit, what would happen is that it looks robotic. So, yun yung important thing about rotoscoping. It is used as a reference, and it's not merely used for you to just trace. And it's used mostly after you have done your rotoscoping, it's important for you to emphasize some of the movements. So how do you exaggerate? So the first example is we have curving the lines of action further. You can see that one in your notes. Or you can also see this on the second one, more exaggerated silhouette. So you can see on the first one, the line of action is, there's a curve, pero it's not very well defined. Pero once you move on to the second one, you can see a very clear curve. The third one, it becomes clearer, and then the fourth one right here, you can see that it's almost like a C for the curved line of action. Another example for the silhouette is something like this. I'd like you to focus on the left arm, the left hand. Yung left hand natin, it's somewhat overlapping with the torso. So this is an example of tangent right here. So you can see that the line for in between yung forefinger mo and yung middle finger mo is also in line with that of the torso. So it's a tangent, that's minus point. Another minus point is that it's overlapping. So when you paint this completely black or in a completely solid color, you can still see the hands. However, you won't see the entirety of the hand. The second one is a bit better. You can see very clearly the hand. You can see the the fingertips of the hand. You can just, for this one, if you were to paint this black, the first one right here, you would just see a palm. Whereas for this one, you can kind of see the fingertips. And you can kind of see that even though it's still technically overlapping, only a small portion of the forefinger is overlapping with the torso. The third one is again a better application. You can see that it's clearly separated from the torso, and you can also clearly see the fingers even though you completely black this out. Another the last example, or the last way of how you can exaggerate, is to add something which we call as animation blurs or smears. Animation blurs and smears are mostly done for in-betweens. It's not meant to be done for keyframes. The animation blurs are these small effects animation. So these lines right here that would help you understand yung movement ng action. So we'll have more of these ones in the finals. So here we have some examples. So one example that I'll be showing is just the facial expression. This one in itself, the shock one, can give you the idea of shock. However, making the character's hair go up is a little bit of a caricature. So it's just one exaggeration, but this one simple exaggeration makes it even more impactful. Next one is we have for arcs. When you're creating movement, or when you're creating movement, we have something which we call as the path of action. The path of action is the movement of the arms, the facial expressions, and so on and so forth. A lot of the movements that we have usually moves in arcs or curved lines that can be either a C curve, an S curve, or as long as it's a curve. So these movements make it so that the action has a better flow. However, there are some exceptions, like let's say mechanical devices. They tend to move in straight lines. If your character moves in straight lines, it would make it look like the character is mechanical and robotic. So for example, we have here the face movements. So this is an example of something which we call as head turn, because you're turning your head from one side to another side. So as you can see right here, the movement of the head is circular. So magpababa siya. So I think it's like a concave. It's possible for you to move your head in a straight line. Pero itong straight line movement na to makes it look like the character is robotic. Adding a little bit of curve makes it a bit more natural. Other examples are for face elements and for arm movements. So like let's say yung sa may arm natin, if you're going to move your arm na nakababa lang tapos pataas, it's possible for you to do that in a straight line. So however, yung pag-move ng kamay natin is very robotic in nature. Whereas if you move your arm like all the way up, you can see that the movement is more of a curved line and it looks more natural. Next one is squash and stretch. Squash and stretch helps you indicate the rigidity of an object during movement. There are two types of things that we have to focus on. Squash, which is the compression of an object, and we have stretch as the expansion of an object. An important thing about squash and stretch is that you have to make sure that the volume is the same. What do we mean by volume? So we have an example here, the photo for the squash. So ito yung start natin ng jump cycle. So the one in black is the squash. The one below it, the one with the lower opacity, is the normal volume. You can see that for you to be able to squash, you have to make the character shorter. And at the same time, you have to make sure that the volume here is also expanded. So you can see right here that even though that the character became shorter, you have to compensate it by adding a little bit more volume at the sides. Hindi dapat siya nawawala. So like for example, if you're going to create a stretch, so it became shorter, pero same pa rin yung volume natin dito sa may sides, it's not an example of squash because you have compromised yung volume niya. Same is true with the stretch. You would see that the character is taller, pero at the same time, it also became thinner compared to that of the original one. Because the volume here at the top to make the character longer has also made it thinner. So how do you use it? You can also use it for dialogue. So for example, when you're squashing and stretching your face. So when you're pouting, you would usually squash your cheeks. And at the same time, parang liliit yung chin mo. if you have a surprised facial expression, your face would become longer, yet at the same time, yung cheeks natin would disappear because it's making up for that loss in volume sa may baba. Other examples is doing facial expressions, indicating body weight, showing the rigidity of the object. So we have an example here na it has a lot more squash, which can probably indicate more of a water balloon. And we have something like here, which can emphasize of a tennis ball or something. Another important part for squash and stretch is that they come together at the same time. I mean, they come together in pairs. When you do a squash, you have to do a stretch before and after. It is possible for you to do a squash without a stretch, however. Next one, we have secondary action. So, medyo patapos na tayo. Secondary action is a complement to that of the main action. As I've stated, usually you have only one main action. Pero yung one main action na yun, to emphasize its intensity, you have to add other smaller actions. So it gives you more interest and more intensity to that one certain action. One example that I'll be focusing on is the running motion that we have here. So when you're running, of course, yung main action mo is yung legs mo. Pero at the same time, when you're running, especially when you're sprinting or when you're running at a very fast pace, you would see a lot more movement. So for example, yung sa may clothing natin, if you're wearing like a loose top or when you're wearing a jacket, you would see that it would flow more. If you have longer hair, you would see that your hair would flow more in the wind. Your arms also would create much more movement if you are sprinting very quickly. Next one, other examples is we have yung ball and then waiting for someone to call. Next one is we'll be moving on to follow through and overlapping action. So for follow through and overlapping action, it's an example of secondary action. Follow through is this one. Your secondary action stops after your main action has stopped. So ang pinaka-keyword natin for follow through is if the main body stops. So what happens here is that even though the main body has stopped already, we have this example for a head turn of a dog sa may baba. So let's have yung third to the last frame. So yung third to the last frame natin, you can see that the character has stopped already. Pero at the same time, you would see that the jowls is still moving at, still trying to catch up. Once na nag-stop siya, you would see that the jowl as well as the ears have moved on beyond kung saan man siya nag-stop. And then, before it moves on to the next plate. I mean, before it settles down. So, this example right here, yung second to the last natin, it kind of mimics the first law of physics, which is inertia. So, one example also is when you immediately stop a car. So, like let's say when you're riding a jeepney and then biglang nag-stop yung si manang driver. What would happen to you is that your body would move forward as well before it actually moves back on. So that's an example for follow through. We have also another example for overlapping action. If follow through is when a main body stops, overlapping action is when the main body changes direction. So overlapping action, if a main body changes direction, the other parts follow as well. So the example that I'll be using is the twirling animation, which is much better to see. So we have two examples of twirling animation. I've placed the second one for those who are using the PDF para mas makita ninyo. You can also see examples of twirling ballets like pirouettes or things like that. Pero let's focus on the second one. So you can see that the face of this anime girl is at the front. Or you would also see that the right foot is already moving towards the back. However, yung ponytail niya sa may left side is still going towards the back. So it's still trying to catch up. So you would notice that the movement of the person, even though that the person is twirling in one direction, some of the movements, like let's say even the skirt and the arms and the ponytail, would be moving in different directions. So even though that the entire torso is already at the front, you would see that the pigtail and then yung ribbon natin dito is still moving from the back. And then itong nasa may right leg natin, it's already moving towards the next direction. Lastly, we have solid drawing. For solid drawing, this is essentially the way cartoons are drawn for reproduction of life. So the basic principles of drawing form, weight, volume, solidity, and so on and so forth, it's basically making your character look 3D. Ibig sabihin, it moves at a 3D space even though that it's only technically 2D. In some cases, they would even say that it has to move in 4D because it has to move at a certain time. So how do you present solid drawing? So number one is making the basic shapes three-dimensional. So when you were learning how to create anatomy, you were taught how to use basic shapes. Nung 11A, you would use like circles, rectangles, ovals, and so on and so forth. When you move to animation 11B, probably, you were taught more on foreshortening. And in foreshortening, you were taught not to think of a circle as a circle, but the circle as a sphere. You have to learn more that the arms and the legs aren't necessarily ovals, but they're more of cylinders. So parang ganun yung idea ng 3-dimension. Pangalawa is proper lighting. It's basically adding proper lighting and shadowing that could give the idea of 3-dimensionality. So like let's say when we're seeing our faces, you would see that when you hit the light of the face in a certain angle, there are some places that have more shadow compared to that of others. Next one is for texturing. It's not usually used in animation. However, it gives you more visual interest. Like let's say in Chowder right here. Next one is for use of camera shots and angles. So when you're creating an animation, it's not practical for you to just use medium shot all the time or close-up shot all of the time or even long shot all of the time. You have to make sure that you use different camera angles and camera shots even in one scene. So for example, we have Kuroko no Basuke right here. You see that it starts at a somewhat long shot and then it moves to a medium shot and then close-up shot to almost a POV shot. So you can see that the character moves. It turns towards its side, tapos magba-back view, tapos biglang magpa-front view for you to be able to properly see the characters in 3D. Nextly, we have foreshortening, which were probably taught to you previously. It's the technique of depicting a character, object, or background with projection or extension of space using some pointed perspectives, like 1-point perspective, 2-point perspective, and 3-point perspective. Lastly, we have parallaxing. Parallaxing is more for backgrounds. We might not have the chance to do this, pero just to explain it to you, this is how it works. Usually, a background is divided into different layers. So the first layer right here that you can see, you have the ones in detail. This is your very foreground. You can see the second layer, the one in color black, yung parang scaffolding natin and just a few houses. And then you can see another third layer, which is in this green-gray color. It almost blends into the background, and then you have the background itself. So parallaxing takes up a pivot point. So if we have a moon right here, that would be your pivot point. You would notice that the ones at the very front moves at a faster rate compared to that of the second layer. The second layer would move faster to that of the third layer, and usually yung pinaka-background, if you have a moon there, it would not move so much. Sometimes it would not even move at all. So that's the example of parallaxing. That would give you the idea that it's somewhat moving at a certain time, and at the same time, it's really you can see that the movement is 3D. So that's your 12 principles of animation. We have here the 21 foundations of animation. However, it's not really, it's somewhat new. So as you can see in the infographic right here, it's only created 2018. So it's a very new idea. So if you're going to see a lot of the 21 foundations of animation, it has a lot of derivatives. Like for example, for keys and breakdowns, it's related to straight ahead animation and post-to-post animation. However, it's a more detailed perspective. You would see this one later, or for professional animators, they know all of these ones by heart already. However, for this one, it has updated it even more. It has detailed it even more. So those are just some of the 21 foundations of animation. Because of our time, we won't be able to have the discussion. Pero I hope you're able to share them through either yung text channels natin in Animation 12A or your text channel for your section.